well, hello everybody. We are back. I'm here to do another video. This is going to be our first video as we read our section on Ignatius of Antioch. So hopefully the reading is going pretty well for everyone. We are reading the book The Four Witnesses by Rod Bennett, and this past week we started the first part on Ignatius of Antioch. This section has 57 pages in my version, and so basically what we're doing is dividing these up into 4 weeks, and so reading a little under 15 pages per week so that in 1 month we'll be finished with this section on Ignatius. So whichever book version you have, just take the total number of pages divided by 4, and so hopefully up to this point you've read the first week, so the first approximately 14, 15 pages. So for our video for this week, I wanted just to do something very brief. It's not going to be a long video this time, but as we begin reading the first part of our section on Ignatius of Antioch, you'll see almost immediately there's mention of the Coliseum in Rome. And as I started to read, I started to ask myself the question, well, where did St. Peter die compared to where tradition tells us Ignatius of Antioch died? Are they the same location, different locations? So I asked that question and thought that y'all might ask that question as well. So I wanted to investigate that a little bit, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in this video. And then in this chapter, there's also going to be a discussion about how Ignatius, Bishop Ignatius was arrested, and then how he was led by Roman soldiers all the way to the city of Rome. And Rod Bennett will mention some of the places that they travel, but I was curious to kind of look at this from the standpoint of seeing it on a map. Looking at a map, seeing where it was exactly that Ignatius traveled as he was being taken as prisoner to Rome. And so I wanted to show you some of those things that I looked up and researched to present to you. Now, I'm not a history major or geography major, but I just kind of wanted to let you know what I found on the internet. And from everything I found, these seem to be pretty reliable sources, so hopefully they're pretty accurate. So the first thing I want to talk about are the arenas. There's several popular arenas that existed in the first century in the city of Rome, and you've probably heard of some of them. The Coliseum is one of them. Another popular one is the Circus Maximus, but there's a couple others. I wanted to show you a map and let you know kind of what that looked like. So here is one map of the city of Rome that I found that is likely what the city looked like in the first century. And as you look at this map, this depiction of the map of Rome, you'll note various temples that are kind of listed on this map, but you'll also see the Circus Maximus. Before we even start talking about the Circus Maximus and some of these other structures, I first want to point out the 7 hills of Rome. Often you've heard reference to it, as I have, that there's 7 hills in the city of Rome, in the city proper. And this map actually shows you these 7 hills. You'll see another hill kind of depicted in the distance, but I've circled the 7 hills of the city of Rome, just kind of in case you're interested what these were. So these are the 7 hills of Rome, and you can see this depiction also gives the names of these different hills. So I just thought that was interesting. But if we go back to this same map, here is the Circus Maximus that I have circled in red. And the Circus Maximus, I'll talk more about that in just a moment. And then also on this map, you'll see the area where the Circus Flaminius is located. Now you can't see it drawn on this map, so what I did was put a red square, a red rectangle, near the Capitoline Hill, which is where the Circus Flaminius was. There was just not enough room, it looks like, on whoever made this depiction of the city of Rome. There's just not enough room there to put the Circus Flaminius, but this is the location that it is. Now, I did find this other map of Rome, slightly different depiction of it. Excuse me. And on this map, you will see both the Circus Maximus and the Circus Flaminius. So I've circled both of those in red. And then on this map, the little dark gray shaded areas represent the hills of Rome, which I already referred to. But here are 2 of the arenas that existed in the first century. I want to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about what I learned about these 2 different arenas. First, we'll talk about the Circus Flaminius. This was built around 221 BC, and what I found says that it was the site of obscure games, primarily horse races or other equestrian events. Sometimes assemblies were held here, but this stadium had no permanent seating, and there's not really mention of any other types of games being held here. So it was arena, but it was not necessarily one of the most popular venues. Now, on the other hand, the Circus Maximus was a lot more popular and was used a lot more often. The Circus Maximus was a large chariot racing stadium and also a mass entertainment venue, and it was built around 6 BC. It was completely wooden initially, but then it was damaged very significantly by a fire, and Emperor Trajan kind of rebuilt it and redid it in 103 AD. And the Circus Maximus could accommodate about 150,000 spectators. And in the Circus Maximus would have been chariot racing, horse racing, various athletic events. They would also do large-scale plays, gladiator fighting, beast hunts or animal hunts, and there would also be public executions. And then also oftentimes when they would have games or events here, there would be large parades and processions that would often be at the beginning of the games and sometimes even at the end of the games. So that's the Circus Maximus. Let's see. So this is another map that I found depicting the city of Rome. And on this one, it looks like it's a little bit later dated, sometime around the year 100 AD during the reign of Emperor Trajan. But the reason I wanted to show you this map is because it depicts some other structures that are of interest. So you don't see the Circus Flaminius drawn here, but if you remember, it's kind of there by Capitoline Hill. But you will see on this map is the Circus Maximus. But also on this map is the Circus of Nero, and so that's an important location. This was a little bit more remote from the center of the city, as you can see, but the Circus of Nero, or sometimes called the Circus of Caligula, this was outside of the city proper, and it began being built by Caligula, and it was finished by the Emperor Claudius in the middle of the 1st century AD. And I'll show you a depiction of this later, but there was also a cemetery that was very near this stadium, this Circus of Nero. And it was here in the Circus of Nero, or the Circus of Caligula, the same name for the same location. It was here that St. Peter was executed, and he was executed under the reign of the Emperor Nero. And here's one depiction of kind of a drawing of the Circus of Nero, of what it might have looked like. And then here's another depiction. From what I could tell, I think this was another depiction of what the Circus of Nero may have looked like in the 1st century. But the tradition tells us that St. Peter was executed here, and tradition tells us that St. Peter was buried in the cemetery right near this Circus of Nero. And so what tradition holds is that here in the Circus of Nero, St. Peter was crucified upside down, and then Christians took his body and buried him in the nearby cemetery. So here's another depiction of this area. You'll see on this drawing, it's called the Circus of Caligula. But like I said, it goes by another name, the Circus of Nero also. And then you see on this drawing, it points to the obelisk in the venue. And I'll come back to talking about this obelisk in a minute. And then you'll see the cemetery is drawn right adjacent to the Circus of Caligula, the Circus of Nero. And so tradition tells us that St. Peter was crucified upside down in the Circus of Caligula, the Circus of Nero, and then immediately buried by Christians in the adjacent cemetery. And then the burial site of St. Peter was honored by Christians for centuries until eventually the Emperor Nero decided to build a church over the burial site of St. Peter. And so this is, over time, this would be remodeled several times, but this is what we call St. Peter's Basilica, which is in Rome, in the Vatican today. But here is one depiction of a drawing of St. Peter's Basilica, and then the green lines that you see in this are an outline of the Circus of Nero, or the Circus of Caligula, where it would have been in the 1st century. And then again, you see in the center portion of this Circus of Nero is another green line, which is kind of like this centerpiece of the circus, and you'll see an obelisk, an arrow pointing to the obelisk. And again, I'll come back to the obelisk. But this is where the Circus of Nero lied, or I guess it's where it existed in the 1st century, and you'll see just next to it where St. Peter's Basilica is today and how there's some overlap. And this is because the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica was made over the gravesite of St. Peter. And I'm going to show you some images of that here in a minute too. But this is the Circus of Nero, or the Circus of Caligula, with a drawing of St. Peter's Basilica covering a portion of the old circus. And then the obelisk, which I'll go ahead and speak about really briefly. Tradition holds this might have been the last thing that St. Peter saw when he was crucified upside down. That obelisk that was in the Circus of Nero has since been moved to the center of St. Peter's Square, and you can see it in Rome today. And on top of this obelisk today is a cross to kind of signify how Christianity has conquered paganism, and how Christ is victorious. And so that obelisk is still there. And like I said, tradition holds this was the same one that would have been in the Circus of Nero that St. Peter would have been looking at as he died. So that's kind of an interesting point. But what I want to go back to also talking about is St. Peter's tomb. So again, the Circus of Caligula was right next door to the cemetery. St. Peter's body was taken and buried. And then first Emperor Constantine built the original St. Peter's Basilica over St. Peter's tomb, with the main altar being over St. Peter's tomb. And then over the centuries, this has been rebuilt and renovated several times, and there's several altars, but it was always the case that the altar was built over St. Peter's tomb. And then you can see in this depiction these layers, and how the present high altar today is situated directly over St. Peter's tomb. And if you go on what's called the Scavi tour, if you go to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, you can go on the Scavi tour and go all the way down to this lower level and go visit the site of St. Peter's tomb, and you can do that even today. So this is, again, St. Peter's Basilica built over the site of St. Peter's tomb, but also, a portion of the Circus of Nero is in that location as well, kind of fitting with the history of how it was that St. Peter died. And so that's the Circus of Nero, or the Circus of Caligula, just outside of this city of Rome proper, where St. Peter died. And now that's going to be different than our character in the book, Ignatius. And so I want to kind of take you back to the map. This again is the map of Rome during the time of Trajan. And you have the Circus Maximus, and then you see the Circus of Nero. And then I want to point out that I'm going to show you the Colosseum, but just before I even mention the Colosseum, here is the House of Nero. You can see this, and then right next to that will eventually be built the Colosseum. And I'll speak about the Colosseum here in a moment. But the House of Nero and the Colosseum. And the Colosseum is where Rod Bennett is going to mention how Ignatius of Antioch, tradition tells us, was taken here, and it was at the Coliseum where Ignatius of Antioch would be killed. And so the Colosseum, to speak about that very briefly, you'll see it spelled two different ways, but it's either referred to as the Colosseum, or it's also known as the Flavian Amphitheater. And it's one of the most well-known images when you think about the city of Rome. And the Colosseum is distinct from the other venues that we've talked about. This is a reproduction of what it might have looked like in the 1st century. And then this is another reproduction of what it might have looked like within the city. And with the Colosseum, it began being built in 72 AD, and it was finished in the year 80 AD. And it said that much of the funding for its construction was from the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And in this siege, the Romans sacked Jerusalem, if you recall, and they destroyed the city. They set fire to the Jewish temple, and they kind of ransacked everything. They took the city's gold and wealth and took many things from the Jewish temple. And so it's said that the money and the wealth that the Romans acquired from this siege of Jerusalem, a lot of it was used to fund the building of the Colosseum. And then it's also reported that about 100,000 Jewish people were taken as prisoners of war by the Romans and taken back to Rome, and that they were used as manual laborers to help build this structure, to help build the Colosseum. Once it was finally built, it held around 50,000 to 80,000 spectators, and within the Colosseum you would have gladiator events, animal hunts, executions, reenactments of various battles and plays, and some of these events were on huge scales. And this is kind of a common image of what we see, of what it looks like today, the ruins of the Colosseum. So a very kind of iconic view of Rome is the Colosseum here. But back to speaking about it, I want to show you just kind of this side-by-side image of, on the left you'll see the map kind of where the Colosseum was situated around the year 100 AD, and then this is an image of the ruins of the Colosseum today. This is actually a picture that I took a couple years ago when I was able to visit Rome, but I'll show you that side by side as I tell you a little bit more about the Colosseum. So during the time of the Emperor Trajan, so around the year 100 AD, he's known for having some huge events at the Colosseum, and you'll learn a little bit more about Emperor Trajan in our chapter, because it is the Emperor Trajan who is responsible for the arrest and execution of Ignatius of Antioch. So you'll read more about Emperor Trajan in this chapter. But the Emperor Trajan, the history reports that he is known to host some of the largest events in the Colosseum. And there are some reports that around the year 107 AD, that Emperor Trajan held events on such a grand scale to celebrate some of his victories in battle. And there's one instance in the year 107 AD where he held events consecutively for 123 days, having event after event on a huge scale in celebration of victories. And during this time, it's said that there were various contests, reenactments, performances by acrobats and magicians. There were animal hunts, and supposedly during this 123-day period of time, there were over 10,000 gladiator fights. And during the executions with the animals, these animal hunts where they would send animals into the arena to kill each other or to kill humans, oftentimes whenever you would have the animals sent in to hunt the humans in the Colosseum as part of one of these events, the people who were condemned to death were often sent into the arena naked and unarmed to face the beasts, and then they were literally torn to pieces. So it was horrific and tragic, but you would have thousands and thousands of spectators watching these things, and the events would often last all day long. And so just imagine these different types of events went on for 123 consecutive days at one point under the Emperor Trajan. But in general, for most emperors, they would not have consecutive days like this, but they would definitely periodically throughout the year hold large-scale events, often involving executions, either by the animals hunting the humans or gladiators killing each other, or other various types of executions, and many of them are known to have occurred in the Colosseum. So Rod Bennett will talk about that in this chapter, that it's under the Emperor Trajan that Ignatius of Antioch was arrested, and tradition tells us that Ignatius was killed in the Colosseum. And then with the Colosseum, it continued to be used frequently for over a century. In the year 217, it sustained significant damage in a fire. It underwent various repairs in the year 240, 250, 320 AD. And then gladiatorial fights are last mentioned being held in the Colosseum around the year 435 AD. Then there's some mention of animal hunting that continued, but the last mention of these was around 523 AD. And then after that time, the Colosseum started to be used for a variety of things over the next several centuries. There's mention that it was used for a cemetery for a time. There's mention that some of the upper levels of the Colosseum were rented out as space for workshops or even housing. In the year 1200s, there's mention of a family buying the Colosseum and then fortifying it to turn it into like a castle. And there's other numerous reports of different things that was used for over time. But in 1349, the Colosseum sustained severe damage in an earthquake, and a lot of the stones fell. And so rather than being rebuilt, a lot of the stones were taken to be used to build churches and hospitals and other buildings throughout parts of Rome. And then one of the other things we hear about the Colosseum, besides the fact it never really was rebuilt, was that in the mid-14th century through early 19th century, there are reports that a religious order kind of took the Colosseum and inhabited it for a time, taking care of it, kind of using it as their housing for a short time. And then in 1749, Pope Benedict XIV declared that the Colosseum was a sacred space because so many Christians had been martyred there. And so he dedicated it, he consecrated it to the Passion of Christ, and he installed the Stations of the Cross in the Colosseum. And so after that time, it really was not used for anything more than as being kind of seen as something sacred. And then you'll see even today, like Pope Benedict XVI and other popes have used the Colosseum every Easter on Good Friday for the Stations of the Cross, or the Way of the Cross. And here's a couple images. First, this is the image of the inside of the Colosseum, as you'll see the ruins today, what the inside of it looks like. You can kind of imagine it having the floor covered likely in sand, and then the seating areas and different different levels of seating that would have been there. But it's just kind of the inside of the ruins. And then this is an image of one of the events with, I think it was Pope Benedict XVI, who had the Way of the Cross at the Colosseum on Good Friday. And you have many people who come attend, and he walks, within the Colosseum for the different Stations of the Cross. This is just another depiction of that same event of the Way of the Cross on Good Friday. So, but going back to these different venues, hopefully this helps to make a little bit of a distinction between these popular arenas. So you have the Circus Flaminius that I mentioned that was not really used for many things. It was more for obscure events. But then the Circus Maximus, which was fairly well known and for a lot of different events, including gladiator games. And then the Circus of Nero, or the Circus of Caligula, where St. Peter was martyred. And then where you have St. Peter's Basilica built over the site of Peter's tomb and portions of the Circus of Nero today. And then you have the Coliseum, which is where Rod Bennett will talk about how tradition says Ignatius of Antioch was martyred there. So hopefully this helps to clarify some of these different venues for you as you continue to read about Ignatius of Antioch and his story. But the last thing I want to talk about in this video, just briefly, is I want to show you some maps, because I think it's important, at least for me it is, visually to see some of the places that will be referred to as we learn about Ignatius of Antioch and how he was arrested and taken from Antioch to Rome. And there'll be mention of many different locations where he traveled, but also locations of where he wrote his letters. So I want to show you that real briefly in these maps. So the first map that I'm just going to put up here is a map of the Roman Empire in the 1st century, just so you have an idea of what that would have looked like. And then this is going to be a map of the Roman Empire, but what it's depicting, all these different colored markers, is that there are different theories and different proposals about the exact route that St. Ignatius of Antioch was taken. We know that he was taken in the city of Antioch, and he ended up in the city of Rome. But the route that he was taken by the soldiers to get there is some debate and dispute over this. And so this was one map of And I colored in these different colored lines to show you some of the different proposed travel locations and traveling routes that he might have taken to get to Rome, from Antioch to Rome. So this is just to help you realize there are some debates about this and disputes about this, but what Rod Bennett will talk about in our book is the most common route that is proposed. And so this is a map of that common route that Rod Bennett will refer to. And it has Ignatius traveling from Antioch to Rome. And along his journey, Rod Bennett is going to mention some of the common places that it is thought where he went. So in this map, I'm going to circle each of these places in yellow. So he starts in Antioch, and then Rod Bennett will talk about how he travels to Seleucia. Then he is taken to Tarsus. Then he is taken to Laodicea. Then Ignatius is taken to Sardis and Philadelphia. And then he is taken to Smyrna. And in Smyrna, he likely stayed there for about 6 months. And then he is taken to Troas, or what we also call the city of Troy, but Troas. And then eventually from there, he's taken to Philippi and then to Rome. As you can see, this map kind of continues on from there, from Troas to Philippi, then to Rome. And so some of his travels are across land, some of his travels are by sea. And this is, again, like I said, this is probably the most common proposed route that Ignatius was taken by the Roman soldiers from Antioch to the city of Rome. Now, along the way, Ignatius is going to meet some people, and he's also going to write some letters. So I want to show you where it is, and Rod Bennett will mention this in the book, but I want to show you this on the map. So when he was in Smyrna, we know that he met a man named Polycarp, who was bishop of Smyrna. We know he met Onesimus, who was bishop of Ephesus. He met a man, Damas, or Damas, D-A-M-A-S, Damas or Damas, who was the bishop of Magnesia. He met Polybius, who was bishop of Tralles. And then in Smyrna, he wrote his letters to the Magnesians, the Ephesians, the Trallians, and the Romans. So I want to throw this map up onto the screen because this is showing you some of the cities and where they exist as to where the letters went. So again, when he was in Smyrna, he met several bishops and spoke to them and talked to them in person. And then he also wrote letters to the Christians in these cities. So while in Smyrna, again, he wrote letters to the Christians in Magnesia, Ephesus, and then he wrote to the Trallians and to the Romans. And so you can see a few of these cities on this map. And then if we go back to his traveling route, after he went to Smyrna, he went to the city of Troas, or the city of Troy. And while he was there in Troas, he wrote letters to the Philadelphians, to the Smyrnans, and then he wrote a personal letter to Bishop Polycarp, who was his really good friend, who was bishop of Smyrna. And then after he was in Troas, as I mentioned earlier, he went likely to Philippi and then to Rome. And then it was in Rome where he was taken, most likely to, what tradition tells us, to the Coliseum. And in the Colosseum, he died as a martyr for the faith. And in this chapter, you'll read more about Ignatius, about his travels, and you'll read more about his death. So I'm not going to get into that too much in this video, but we'll look at that later. And then you'll also in this chapter start to begin to look at some of the letters he wrote to these various Christians in these different cities. And we're going to talk more about that later. But I just wanted today to give you a little bit of a visual so that as you continue to read, you can see where some of these locations and where that we're going to talk about, not only where Ignatius traveled, but also the people to whom he wrote, the Christian people to whom he wrote. So that's it for this video, just kind of short and hopefully helpful as you continue to read about Ignatius. And then our next video, we'll talk more about what we've been reading in this first half of Ignatius of Antioch in this chapter, learning more about who this man was and what happened to him. And then as the chapter continues, we'll dive into some of his letters to see what they say and why they were important at that time, but also why they are still important to us today. But all right, well, I'll let you get back to reading. If you have any questions or comments or anything, please feel free to post those in the comment section on the video. But otherwise, we'll let you get back to reading. Have a good week. Thank you, and God bless you.